They say churches are places where heaven touches earth, where the desperate seek redemption and the broken find peace. But not all churches were built for salvation. Some were built to hide things, dark things, things not meant to be named. Take, for example, the forgotten town of Harlow's End, Vermont, a place erased from most maps, hidden by trees older than the Constitution itself. At its heart sits St. Mary's Church, a Gothic skeleton of stone and rotted oak, constructed in 1861 by men who never left any written record of its funding or purpose. No one knows who paid for it. No blueprints exist. And the most disturbing detail, it was built over a cave, one sealed by bricks blackened with ash and covered in Latin inscriptions that scholars still argue were intentionally distorted. For decades, nothing happened, until 1974, when Father Edmund, a Vietnam veteran turned clergyman, arrived to take over the dwindling congregation. He kept a journal. In it, he described dreams of an underground choir, of voices harmonizing in a language no living person could understand. At first, he thought it was stress, but the dreams became waking hallucinations. One night during a snowstorm, he wrote, "The walls are breathing, they exhale rot." His final entry simply read, "It's underneath." That same week, Father Edmund vanished. His car was still parked behind the rectory. His Bible was still on his desk, but his rosary was found, wrapped tightly around the door handle of the sealed cave below the altar. Authorities pried open the bricks, expecting old storage space or maybe a catacomb. What they found was far worse. The chamber below was circular, 30 feet wide, and filled with books, hundreds, maybe thousands, each bound in dark leather, some stitched with coarse human hair, others marked with symbols not known to any theological or academic discipline. When one officer opened a book and turned to the center page, he screamed so loudly that 2 of his teeth cracked. He was hospitalized that night and institutionalized 3 days later. He never spoke again, but sometimes he laughed. Not joyfully, no. He laughed like something inside him was mocking the world through his voice. Researchers from Boston came to investigate, but the books were gone by then. The entire chamber was empty, and the church sealed itself shut 2 weeks later. Doors jammed, windows fused to their frames, as if the building had exhaled its last breath and didn't want to be opened again. The townspeople say that if you stand near the church on the winter solstice, you can still hear that choir, faintly, like whispers sown into the wind. And some say they've seen Father Edmund standing in the window, mouthing words they can't hear, his eyes completely black. But here's the part no one talks about. Every family who regularly attended St. Mary AS in the 70s has either gone missing or died in circumstances that baffle local authorities. Fires without a source, drownings without water, suicides with no visible wounds. When questioned, the last surviving church organist, an elderly woman named Ruth, refused to speak but handed a journalist a sealed envelope. Inside was a torn piece of parchment written in faded ink. "He waits in stone." And below that, something in Latin, "Silere aut perire." Translated, "Be silent or perish." The church still stands, untouched by weather, unmarked by time. Even the trees around it seem to bend away, like they too fear what lies beneath. So the next time you pass a church and feel a sudden coldness in your chest, ask yourself, is it really God watching you? Or something older? Something buried? Something hungry? One church down, 9 more to go, and believe me, they only get worse. In the dusty heart of the Arizona desert, where the sun scorches the earth and shadows seem to crawl closer with each passing hour, stands a church known only as the Sanctuary of St. Gabriel. Unlike the grand cathedrals of the East Coast or the quiet chapels tucked into New England hills, this church is a monument of raw, brutal simplicity. Its cracked adobe walls almost blending into the barren landscape, its windows boarded and darkened for decades. The locals speak of it in whispers, claiming it was never really a place of worship, but rather a prison for something far more sinister. The story begins in 1923, when a group of settlers, desperate to escape the horrors of war and disease, sought refuge in this unforgiving land. They built the church atop a patch of red soil rumored to be cursed, where indigenous tribes once held secret ceremonies to ward off dark spirits. The settlers' pastor, a man named Jeremiah Cole, was not like other priests. His sermons were filled with references to hellfire and eternal damnation, his eyes burning with a fire that unnerved even the bravest parishioners. One day, the congregation found him chained to the altar, his body writhing in agony, his voice a low growl that no human throat should ever produce. He begged them to leave before the darkness awoke, but it was too late. That night, every candle in the church blew out at once, and a guttural chanting echoed from the walls themselves. When dawn came, Pastor Cole was gone, and the church was empty, except for a single crude drawing etched into the altar's stone, a spiral that seemed to twist inward forever. Over the following years, strange phenomena plagued the nearby town. Cattle mutilations, sudden disappearances, and a creeping madness that claimed the minds of those who dared to investigate. Archaeologists sent to study the site found evidence of underground tunnels beneath the church, carved directly into the sandstone. But whenever anyone tried to enter, they were met with an overwhelming sense of nausea and despair, forcing them to retreat. Survivors of these encounters reported visions of shadowy figures lurking just beyond sight, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Some spoke of whispers, half words in a language lost to time, promising power in exchange for loyalty or death for defiance. The most chilling discovery came decades later, when a local historian uncovered a diary hidden within the walls of the rectory, written by a man who claimed to have been the church's first sexton. The diary described a pact made long ago, a covenant with an ancient entity bound beneath the desert, sealed by the blood of innocents sacrificed in secret rites beneath the altar. It warned that the church itself was a gateway, a thin place between our world and something far older, far crueler, and that the spiral symbol was a key designed to keep the darkness contained. Yet the diary ended abruptly with a single line: "The seal weakens, the night approaches." Today, the sanctuary of St. Gabriel remains abandoned, yet travelers who venture close swear they feel a cold wind rising from the cracked earth, carrying with it a faint humming that sounds like a choir of lost souls crying out in torment. Some who've tried to spend the night inside never returned, and their footprints vanish just inside the threshold, as if swallowed by the building itself. What no one dares to say aloud is this: the church doesn't just hide faith, it traps it. It's a cage for something that should never have been disturbed, and every year that passes brings it closer to breaking free. What they discovered next was far worse. Deep in the misty forests of Washington state, nestled between ancient cedars that have stood since before settlers arrived, is a small chapel known as St. Agnes Sanctuary. Unlike most churches, St. Agnes was never meant to welcome the living. It was built to honor those who had crossed over, to serve as a bridge between the mortal world and the afterlife. At least, that's the legend whispered by the locals. The truth, however, is far darker. Constructed in 1892 by a secretive sect whose origins have been lost to time, the church was built atop a burial ground that predates even the Native American tribes of the region. Rumors say that the sect practiced forbidden rituals, blurring the line between the living and the dead, attempting to harness powers no human should possess. For decades, strange lights flickered in the windows at night, and mournful wails echoed through the woods. But no one dared investigate until a group of university students decided to explore the church one autumn, hoping to prove or debunk the stories. They entered on a clear evening, armed with cameras and recording devices, laughing nervously as they crossed the threshold. But the laughter died quickly. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, suffocating even. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing faintly as if alive. And then the chanting began, soft at first, barely audible, growing louder, more insistent. The students found themselves drawn toward the altar, where a strange symbol was carved deep into the wood, a circle intertwined with sharp thorns, bleeding red stains that never dried. One student touched it and screamed as coldness shot through his body, and the others saw his eyes roll back, his voice replaced by a guttural growl. Panic erupted, but the doors slammed shut with a thunderous bang, trapping them inside. As they tried to escape, the walls seemed to shift, corridors twisting into impossible shapes, trapping them in an endless maze. One by one they disappeared, pulled into shadows that swallowed sound and light. The last surviving student was found days later, wandering the forest delirious, mumbling about voices beneath the earth and the veil tearing. He showed a tattoo on his wrist, a mark no one could explain, matching the thorned circle in the church. Investigators who examined the site found the church empty, yet cameras they left behind captured fleeting images of figures moving behind boarded windows and whispered voices urging, "Join us." Attempts to demolish St. Agnes's have failed mysteriously. Explosives don't detonate and bulldozers break down inexplicably. Experts now believe the church exists in a liminal space, a pocket between dimensions where time and reality bend. And the thorned circle, it's not just a symbol, it's a seal. A seal that keeps something locked away, something that hungers for release. But what no one knew is that the night wasn't over yet. Something had already slipped through the cracks, and the forest now listens to the whispers of the lost, waiting, watching, waiting for the veil to tear again. Before you dismiss this as folklore, remember, some churches were never sanctuaries. They were prisons. And some prisons were never meant to be opened. Subscribe to uncover more truths no one dares to speak aloud. The darkness is patient. In the heart of Louisiana, where the humid air carries the scent of moss and decay, lies the forgotten church of St. Augustine. Unlike the grand cathedrals of New Orleans, this small, dilapidated structure is hidden deep within the bayou, swallowed by twisting vines and encroaching shadows. Locals avoid it, speaking in hushed tones about the strange happenings that ripple through the swamp around it. The church's story begins in the early 1800s, built by a French priest named Father Marcel, who came to minister to the scattered settlements along the bayou. Father Marcel was a man of faith, but also a man of secrets. Diaries recovered from the church ruins reveal his obsession with the occult, fueled by letters from Europe about forbidden knowledge and ancient rituals promising power beyond salvation. He is said to have performed ceremonies within the church, invoking spirits from the depths of the swamp, offering sacrifices in exchange for protection against the relentless dangers of the wild. One stormy night, parishioners reported hearing screams carried on the wind coming from the church itself. When a group ventured inside the next day, they found the altar drenched in blood, the floor marked with strange symbols scorched into the wood. Father Marcel was gone, vanished without a trace, but the evil he summoned lingered. Over the years, fishermen and hunters reported bizarre sightings, ghostly figures drifting across the waters, eyes glowing beneath the murky surface, and faint chanting rising from the cypress trees when the moon was full. More unsettling were the disappearances. Those who ventured near the church after dark often returned, changed, speaking in tongues or driven mad by visions of shadowy creatures lurking beneath the water. The bayou seemed alive, as if the church had become a beacon for forces beyond understanding, a nexus where the veil between worlds thinned dangerously. Modern attempts to explore the church's interior have been thwarted by inexplicable phenomena. Compasses spin wildly, radios burst into static-filled screams, and a cold so intense it freezes the soul descends without warning. Researchers who persisted found evidence of a hidden crypt beneath the church, sealed with rusted chains and engraved with warnings in languages no living person could read. Inside, they discovered relics, bones, fetishes, and jars containing dark fluids that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The most chilling artifact was a tattered book bound in human skin, filled with cryptic incantations and drawings of grotesque, otherworldly entities. The pages whispered secrets, promising salvation at a terrible cost. And then, the ground trembled, as if something beneath was stirring, awakening from a centuries-old slumber. The Church of St. Augustine was never a sanctuary. It was a trap, a gateway, a place where faith and fear collide, where the desperate bargain with darkness was made and never forgotten. What they uncovered in those crypts was far worse. In a small town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania stands the St. Bartholomew Church, a seemingly ordinary parish with an extraordinary secret buried beneath its foundations. Constructed in the late 1800s by German immigrants, the church's stained glass windows and soaring steeple have long been symbols of hope and resilience to the local community. But what no one knew for generations was that the church was built atop a hidden labyrinth, an underground network of tunnels and chambers carved by unknown hands long before settlers arrived. This labyrinth, locals say, was once a refuge for occult gatherings and forbidden ceremonies. The first whispers of trouble came when parishioners began reporting visions during Mass, shadows moving independently of their sources, fleeting figures in the periphery that vanished when looked at directly, and an overwhelming sense of dread that crept into the very air. The church's priest, Father Edmund, was a man of unwavering faith, but even he grew uneasy. After dark, strange noises echoed beneath the sanctuary, low chanting, scraping sounds, and the occasional blood-curdling scream. One particularly harrowing night, a group of curious townsfolk ventured into the church's basement, where they found a hidden door concealed behind a rotting tapestry. What lay beyond was a descent into darkness itself, a maze of corridors lined with ancient symbols and walls inscribed with prayers and curses. At the heart of this labyrinth, they discovered a chamber marked by a massive pentagram etched into the stone floor, its points stained a deep crimson. In the center, a stone altar bore the remnants of rituals long forgotten, with bones and charred remains scattered about. Among the ruins, they found manuscripts written in archaic German, detailing the practices of a secret cult that had worshipped a demon they called the Hollow One, a being believed to feed on the souls of the faithful. Father Edmund, desperate to end the terror, attempted to cleanse the church, but vanished during the ritual, leaving behind only a diary filled with frantic warnings and desperate prayers. Since then, the church has been shunned, its doors locked and barred, but the evil beneath it remains. Locals tell stories of lights flickering at night, shadows moving against the windows, and a cold that penetrates even the thickest coats. What's worse is that every year, on the anniversary of Father Edmund's disappearance, townsfolk hear whispers calling from the church, promising salvation or doom. What no one has dared to explore fully is the true extent of the labyrinth beneath St. Bartholomew's, or what still lurks in its darkest chambers, waiting for the day it can walk freely among the living once more. And as the anniversary draws near again, the air grows heavy with the unspoken fear that this night will not end quietly. What they discovered in the depths was far worse. Nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky, the Chapel of St. Michael looks like any other rustic mountain church, a place of peace and prayer for the scattered rural community. But beneath its wooden floorboards lies a chilling secret that has haunted locals for decades. The chapel was built in 1912 by a devout congregation, but over the years, strange disappearances and unsettling phenomena plagued the area. Stories tell of congregants who would vanish during Sunday services, never to be seen again, or those who returned only to speak of nightmares so vivid and terrifying that their minds fractured. An investigation decades ago revealed an underground crypt beneath the chapel, sealed off and long forgotten. Inside, inscriptions in Latin warned of a curse unleashed by a forsaken priest who had made a pact with dark forces to save his dying congregation. The crypt was filled with relics that pulsed with malevolent energy, blood-stained crosses, broken rosaries, and a collection of ancient bones arranged in a pattern that seemed to tell a horrific story of sacrifice and damnation. Locals say that on certain nights, the chapel resonates with unnatural sounds, a choir of whispers rising and falling in anguished harmony, footsteps pacing the empty aisles, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some who dared enter the chapel after dark reported seeing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures in tattered robes, chanting in a language no one alive remembers. Attempts to cleanse the chapel spiritually have only made matters worse, awakening a force that had been dormant for generations. It is said that the chapel itself is alive, an entity feeding on faith, twisted into fear and despair, a place where the boundary between heaven and hell blurs. And the most terrifying part? The curse isn't confined to the chapel's walls. Those who come into contact with the crypt evil often carry its taint back to their homes, spreading darkness beyond the mountains. What the locals fear most is that this curse is growing stronger, that soon the chapel will no longer be a place of worship, but a beacon for something ancient and unspeakable. What no one knows yet is how close that night is. The shadows are gathering, and the chapel waits. But what they discovered in the crypt was far worse. Remember to subscribe if you want to delve deeper into these haunted mysteries, because some truths are too dark to face alone. On the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, a town forever marked by its grim past, stands the Old Hollow Church, an eerie relic from colonial times that has stood silent witness to centuries of secrets. Built in 1692 during the height of the witch trials, the church was originally a gathering place for Puritan settlers seeking refuge and salvation. But beneath its austere wooden pews and simple altar lies a twisted history few dare to acknowledge. The church's cellar, long sealed off and forgotten, was unearthed during a renovation in the early 20th century, revealing a hidden chamber where sinister rites were performed. This chamber contained a circle carved into the floor, surrounded by faint scorch marks and cryptic symbols that echoed the darkest superstitions of the era. Diaries from the time hint that the church's ministers were complicit in the persecution of supposed witches, conducting rituals not just to condemn, but to imprison restless spirits within these walls. Over time, the spirits grew restless, and strange occurrences began to plague the town. Visitors have reported seeing ghostly figures drifting silently through the church's nave, hearing disembodied voices pleading for justice, and witnessing objects levitate or shatter without cause. One chilling account comes from a historian who spent nights cataloging the church's records. He claimed to have been visited by a shadowy figure dressed in colonial garb who whispered warnings of a curse binding the church and its descendants to an eternal cycle of torment and retribution. Attempts to cleanse or exorcise the church have been met with violent resistance, as if some malevolent force refuses to be banished. The Old Hollow Church is more than a relic of history. It is a prison for ancient evils, a site where faith and fanaticism collided to create a legacy of suffering. And as the witching hour approaches, the church seems to pulse with dark energy, as if the spirits it holds captive are preparing to break free. What no one anticipated is the revelation hidden beneath layers of time, evidence of a pact made between the church's founders and a demonic entity, sealing their souls in exchange for power and protection. What they uncovered that night was far worse. In the quiet outskirts of New Mexico, the Mission San Miguel stands as a testament to centuries of faith and hardship, but beneath its adobe walls hides a darkness few speak of. Established in the late 1700s by Spanish missionaries, it was intended as a beacon of hope and salvation to the native tribes, but instead became a stage for horrors that would echo through generations. Local legends tell of the mission's founder, Father Luis, who was consumed by his zeal and fear of damnation. Obsessed with purging evil, he delved into forbidden texts, attempting to control spirits that should never be summoned. When a terrible plague struck the nearby villages, Father Luis believed it was the work of malevolent forces and conducted rituals deep in the catacombs beneath the mission to banish the curse. But instead of peace, he unleashed a far worse evil, something ancient, hungry, and vengeful. The catacombs, filled with the bones of those who died in the plague, became a prison and a playground for dark entities. Those who entered reported disembodied voices echoing through the narrow tunnels, sudden drops in temperature that chilled to the bone, and shadows moving with a will of their own. Over time, several priests disappeared without explanation, and the mission was abandoned, left to crumble under the desert sun. But the curse remained. Residents nearby speak of hearing chanting in the wind and seeing flickering lights inside the mission at night. Strange symbols, matching those found in Father Luis's personal journals, appear etched into the mission walls, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The mission is said to be alive, a vessel for the evil that Father Luis accidentally unleashed. Attempts to investigate have ended abruptly, with researchers experiencing terrifying visions, madness, or physical harm. The greatest fear is that this evil is not contained within the mission, but seeps out into the desert, waiting for the right moment to spread again. And with recent reports of missing hikers in the area, many believe the mission's curse is awakening. What no one expected to find deep within those catacombs was far worse. In the heart of Louisiana's Bayou country lies the Church of St. Agnes, an unassuming chapel surrounded by moss-draped cypress trees and thick, choking fog. Built in the early 1900s by French settlers, it has long been whispered about in hushed tones by locals who know better than to trespass after sunset. The church's history is steeped in tragedy, from violent floods that claimed congregants to inexplicable disappearances that have never been solved. The most disturbing aspect, however, is the church's connection to voodoo, a religion both feared and misunderstood, whose practitioners once used the church grounds for secret rituals. The church's crypt is said to house relics and artifacts stolen or seized from practitioners, objects imbued with spiritual power, but also curses. Over decades, strange phenomena have unfolded, parishioners feeling invisible hands grasp at their throats during prayer, eerie chanting drifting from the swamp, and occasional sightings of a hooded figure wandering the churchyard. Investigators who have dared to explore beneath St. Agnes uncovered a subterranean chamber lined with grisly bags, bone charms, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols, mixtures of Christian iconography and voodoo sigils, blurring the lines between blessing and curse. What was most chilling was the discovery of an altar dedicated to Baron Samedi, the lover of death and resurrection, suggesting the church was a crossroads of conflicting spiritual forces. Those who tried to remove the artifacts suffered from severe nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and in some cases vanished without a trace. The church seemed to be a trap, a place where faith became a weapon and spiritual battles were fought beyond mortal sight. The question that haunts everyone is why such a place of worship became a conduit for darkness instead of light. And now, as strange shadows gather in the bayou and the fog thickens unnaturally, many fear the veil between worlds is thinning. What lurks in the crypt is far worse than anyone could have imagined. In the dense woods of Oregon, tucked away from the prying eyes of the modern world, sits the abandoned Church of St. Mark, once a vibrant place of worship, now a relic haunted by its darkest days. The church was founded in the early 1900s by a charismatic preacher known as Reverend Elijah Crane, whose sermons drew thousands with promises of salvation and divine miracles. But behind the facade of faith was a man driven by obsession and despair, desperate to prove his power over life and death. Legend says Reverend Crane began experimenting with forbidden rituals and occult practices, believing he could bend the will of God to his own. His congregation soon became a cult, bound by fear and blind loyalty. The church records mysteriously ended in 1923, the year Reverend Crane disappeared without a trace, leaving behind whispered rumors of mass disappearances and strange gatherings in the surrounding forest. Decades later, explorers who ventured into the ruins found a secret underground chamber beneath the altar, a grotesque shrine filled with twisted symbols, remnants of ritualistic sacrifices, and journals filled with disturbing confessions. These writings reveal that Crane had tried to summon an ancient spirit, a dark entity said to grant eternal life, but at a terrible price. The spirit, however, twisted the preacher's soul, turning the church into a beacon for evil that corrupted everything it touched. Visitors to the ruins speak of hearing faint chanting carried on the wind, sudden chills that freeze the blood, and shadows that move with an unnatural intelligence. Some have claimed to see ghostly figures of the lost congregation, trapped forever in a nightmarish limbo. The forest surrounding the church is said to be cursed, where even the animals avoid, and where time seems to warp and twist. Those who linger too long are rumored to be drawn into the darkness, never to return. What no one anticipated was the discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the chapel ES foundation, an ancient altar soaked with blood and dark magic, still pulsating with energy. What they uncovered next was far worse. These stories aren't just tales to scare you at night, they are warnings. And as you reflect on what you've heard, remember some places in this world were never meant to be found. Subscribe now if you dare, because the night isn't over yet. There is one more church, one final secret that will shake everything you think you know about faith and fear.